Wind was not natural that night. It twisted through the skeletal fingers of blackened pines like it was looking for something that once lived here and shouldn't have. Snow sat like ash on the rotting cabins of the forgotten New Netherlands. Settlement. The hearth inside still glowed, not from fire, but from memory. A red-orange throb, faint but pulsing like breath beneath the floorboards. They found no bodies, only teeth lined carefully in a circle on the dirt floor. Each incisor pointed inward as if bearing witness. The air-ryer of something more ancient than rot, boiled bone, burnt prayer, and a sweetness that made even the crows abandon the trees. The journal left behind was brittle with blood. It read, "She arrived with the frost. We didn't invite her, but we fed her, and now she feeds us. But enough of the past. Let me ask you something. Quietly tell me, where are you listening from? What corner of the night has swallowed your breath? What time is it where you are? When the floorboards creak without cause and the trees outside, your window forget how to sway, midnight perhaps, or closer to dawn. When ghosts grow impatient and the wind whistles secrets too long buried, are you ready to descend? Because now we begin." In 1616, a Jesuit missionary named Father Renaud disappeared while attempting to map Lappy territory. He had been warned, not by natives, but by Dutch trappers, who called the southern edge of the forest. The weeping pines, trees that creaked without wind, bark that bled when scratched. Still, he pressed on. Months later, his horse was found wandering alone. It carried two things: a leather-bound Bible soaked in something that wasn't water, and a sack of polished teeth. Adult murs, child's incisors, and a single canine filed. To a point, a search party uncovered his camp. His fire was still burning, but beneath the ash was not wood. It was long bones, stirred and cracked. Nearby, someone had built an altar of vertebrae stacked like totems, each one bearing a slice of tongue nailed to it with fishbone pins. A crude journal, charred half-legible, revealed a sickness had overtaken him, not of body, but of appetite. He claimed that the deeper he went, the more he dreamt of chewing roots, bark, insects, meat, especially meat. He wrote, "The Lord no longer speaks to me in Scripture. He speaks in marrow. I hear him chewing." By 1621, whispers of the bone-quiet people had begun to surface in fur trader camps. These were not native tribes, nor were they Europeans. They were something in between, or perhaps left behind. A French trapper claimed he encountered them near Lake Champlain. He described pale, bold figures dressed in stitched hides, their faces masked by layers of stretched, painted skin. He offered them food. They declined. They offered him something instead, a pouch of meat, still warm, wrapped in prayer cloth. He said it tasted of honey at first, then salt, then blood. He awoke 3 days later in a ditch, clutching his own severed toe stitched neatly shut. Other accounts followed, always the same pattern. Missing hunters returned weeks later, mutilated but alive, claiming they had seen visions. One said they do not speak. They chew in circles. Each bite tells them the name of the next sacrifice. The bone-quiet people were never captured, but their dwellings were found. Tree hollows stuffed with smoked flesh, symbols carved into bark that resembled human teeth, and feathers dipped in lard and blood used as they did not leave markings of worship, only preparation. In 1629, settlers founded a secluded farming commune near present-day Shrew Lake. It was called Leestead, and its founders, Dutch Pittists, sought to build a holy life far from the corruption of Europe. They lasted 7 years. Letters recovered from a hollowed tree stump used as their message drop spoke of strange nights, livestock gutted, soil sprouting teeth, and children waking up with bite marks in the shape of unfamiliar jaws. The final message, dated December 7, 1636, was addressed to no one. It read, "The communion has changed. Bread is not enough. Is memory. Bone is contract. Tonight we partake, not to remember Christ, but to feed her, the one beneath. She nor remembers, so must we." All 15 colonists were never seen again. But their dining hall was preserved, some say perfectly. The plates were set, The food rotted but untouched, except the meat that had been scraped clean down to the marrow. And upon the wall, a single sentence written in ash: "We cooked our sins to silence them." In 1640, a pattern emerged. Small colonies deep in the New World wilderness were vanishing. Not through war or disease, but through ritual, mass disappearance, structures left intact. Evidence of shared meals, and symbols etched into wood or bone. That year, a woman named Marit Chervos, the widow of a carpenter, was arrested in Fort Amsterdam after serving a stew of memory to her guests. They fell ill, one died. The rest woke speaking languages they'd never learned, dreaming of places they'd never seen. Maricha confessed to being part of the Hollow Communion, a circle of believers who claimed that human flesh, when properly prepared, revealed ancestral memory. She said she was chosen by a voice in the flames and that she had fed over 30 people their pasts. Execution was swift, but before the rope tightened, she smiled and whispered, "Your grandchildren will taste me." I seasoned myself with legacy. No one claimed her body, but weeks later, her bones were found missing from the grave. Only her teeth remained, buried in the mouths of 5 blackbirds nailed to the gallows. In 1648, a merchant's ledger recorded a strange trade in the Dutch colony. 12 barrels of salted pork purchased with teeth, not coins, teeth. The merchant, William Voss, recounted in his private notes that the customer never spoke. He simply showed a parchment with the phrase, "The feast continues." The meat was later tested. It wasn't pork. It was human, female, multiple sources. The flavor was reportedly sweet with notes of clove. That phrase, "The feast continues," began to appear elsewhere, burned into barn walls. Painted in blood beneath floorboards, etched into the bottom of cooking pots. By 1650, colonial administrators banned the use of unmarked tooth trade in New Netherland. But the warnings came too late. In the forests, laughter echoed at night, childlike high-pitched, always followed by the sound of a blade against bone. In 1657, a cartographer named Jacob Minuet disappeared near the Delaware Gap while mapping the interior. When his map was recovered, it was incomplete, but it contained symbols instead of place names. Circles of teeth, forked tongues, fire altars. In one corner, he had written, "There are churches in the soil." His bones were discovered months later, clean, stacked, or ripped. Scouts who entered the nearby woods reported seeing torches floating without bearers, and songs sung backward in unison by voices that didn't match human throats. One soldier swore he saw a dinner table set in the middle of the forest. 4 skeletons seated, 1 empty chair. As he approached, all 4 skulls turned to face him. The table disappeared when he blinked. Asa Minuet found the map of the Hollow Communion, and that the communion is not just a cult, it's a landscape, a path laid in hunger, and it begins. In the 1600s, as the sun set on the final decade of the 1600s, the communion no longer needed to hide. In 1699, reports came from Fort Orange of an entire farmhouse filled with smoked meat, pickled tongues and ceremonial platters made of polished scapulas. The home belonged to the Durkins, a quiet family of 4. Their eldest son had been seen collecting herbs near a burnt chapel the week prior. Only one body was found. The father seated at the hearth, smiling, his belly opened and filled with cloves, oranges, and ash. A feast turned inward on the mantle, a message carved deep into the stone. When she hungers, we serve ourselves. The 1600s had birthed the Hollow Communion, but its hunger was just beginning. By the turn of the century, 1701 to be precise, the Hollow Communion had stopped hiding. It's no longer confined to woodland whispers or ashen prayers beneath hearths. It began to seep into bloodlines. Carefully, patiently, through the mothers in the New York frontier village of Leston, so named for its rich venison trade, a new midwife had arrived. Her name was Anneliese Crayon, and she came from no known township. She spoke flawless Dutch, but her accent felt wrong, like it had been sewn into her throat from something older, something foreign. Within weeks of her arrival, childbirths changed, quieter, heavier. The newborns cried, not in terror, but in near silence. mooing, snorting, gnawing at the air with toothless mouths wide as screams. When mothers fell ill, they described vivid hallucinations, teeth sprouting from the walls, hands stirring soup from empty pots, their babies whispering prayers while they slept. Analyze brought no husband, no children, but she baked always. Her stews were said to be hearty, soul-warming, but when a neighbor peeked into her larder, they found jars with labels written in an unrecognizable script, each labeled with first names and birth dates. What caused Fleastan's collapse remains debated. Some say famine, others fire, but colonial records tell a quieter tale. 17 children born in 3 years, none survived their second birthday. The ground beneath the midwives' home was found layered with fat-drenched bones. Some no longer infant-sized, all cracked at the center. Nollis was never found, but one note survived, scribbled behind a baking ledger, written in something slick and brown. To grow the tree, we must prune the roots. Taste makes memory. Blood makes language, and bone makes family. In 1705, the infection had spread further west. In a small Lutheran hamlet near the Allegheny Plateau, the Renelair family became both legend and lesson. A well-respected clan, prosperous farmers, devout churchgoers, and known for feeding neighbors during long winters. The family patriarch, Elias Renelair, rode off into his cousin in Albany. Those letters changed in tone after a storm in 1708 left them snowed in for nearly 2 weeks. The family survived, thrived even. But guests who visited in spring reported strange smells in the root cellar and fresh meat with no known livestock butchered that season. Elias's wife, Gertrude, had begun carving strange emblems into their pantry doors. Teeth arranged in spirals with a fork at the center. A visiting deacon noticed the Renelair children never blinked, and they never prayed aloud. The final letter from Elias arrived in August 1709. It read, "We do not read Scripture now. We write it into the flesh. Communion must be taken not in remembrance, but in replication. When we dine, we do not mourn Christ. We become him, but not the man." Ate the meal. Shortly after, the entire Renelair farmstead burned, not from accident. From within, the stone oven had exploded outward. The investigators found no bodies, only bones polished clean. Wrapped in kitchen linens embroidered with a symbol, a spoon piercing a crowned mare. Further inspection uncovered a second oven, hidden underground, larger, blackened with soot. Something else, something that seeped into the soil. By 1707, things had begun to take on structure. Rites replaced instincts, doctrines replaced devotions. The communion was no longer just the act of cannibalism, it was the system of it. In the coastal swamps of Maryland, a failed tobacco plantation was repurposed into what its residents called the table school. It took in orphaned children, runaways, and illegitimate heirs from noble Dutch lines. There was no formal enrollment. It came in wagons and coffins. Few ever left. Run by a man named Professor Motz, a former apothecary disgraced after his experiments with memory preservation through consumption were discovered in Amsterdam. The table school had no desks, only kitchens. Children were taught not letters but cuts, not numbers but bone measurements. They were told to memorize stories by tasting blood. Each week a child was taken behind a curtain and return changed. Eyes dilated, voices calmer, sometimes with new scars or fewer fingers, or with mouths that smelled of marrow. One survivor years later confessed under duress, said the table school trained memory chefs. Young disciples who would carry the gospel of flesh into the emerging American colonies, embedding it into frontier towns under the guise of culinary innovation and healing tradition. He claimed they were taught that the soul once consumed did not simply die. It fermented, it thickened, it lingered in the stomach, that vomiting after such meals was forbidden. Gurgitation was considered spiritual. Abortion. He then bit off his own tongue, smiled, and died. Then, by 1709, signs of resistance had begun. In Massachusetts, a small Puritan circle, calling themselves the Chewer's Bane, began investigating family lineages suspected of communion blood. They tracked births, recorded unexplained disappearances, collected cookware, coated with unnatural residue, and began marking homes with salt in specific patterns believed to starve the memory. They were found slaughtered in a circle, cheeks carved open, teeth shattered, tongues replaced with corn husks. Their last sermon was found scrawled on the back of a funeral shroud. To dine without remorse is to unmake the garden. The chewer returns not as man, but as method. By 1711, the frontier had begun to settle, but the communion had begun to root. In the mist-soaked borderlands between Maryland and Pennsylvania, a new township appeared, seemingly overnight. It called itself Kindred's Parish. There was no charter, no record of founding, and no clergy attached to its name. Only rumors of a warm chapel, plentiful feasts, and silence after dark, and too much silence. Kindred's Parish had no church bells, no graveyard, and no children's laughter. The first outsider to reach it was a traveling cloth merchant named Henry Wilkes, who was permitted to stay one night after his horse collapsed near the wood line. He later wrote from a sanitarium that the town smelled sweet like molasses and raw iron, and that no one ever ate in the daylight. Instead, as dusk fell, the villagers gathered in the chapel, not to pray, but to carve. Silent, efficient. Each meal begun with the presentation of a sealed jar, passed from hand to hand like a chalice. Inside, fat, gelatinous, and still twitching, the children served the meat, the adults chewed reverently. The priest wore no robes, only a mask made of braided hair and wax with a tooth embedded in the forehead. Wilkes fled before dawn, but not before stealing one of their hymns. Etched into the side of a butcher's block was a phrase that haunted him until his death. Those who chew remember. Those who remember obey. Those who disobey are fed. In 1715, colonial officials raided a cluster of barns in the outskirts of Lancaster. The county, after a failed harvest, drove suspicion toward the more prosperous families. What they uncovered was not grain. It was a memory vault. Bones, hundreds of them, carefully shelved in wooden racks like scrolls. Each one labeled in calligraphic ink, names, dates of birth, and what appeared to be emotional states. Mother, grief, father, defiance, Elias, love. The bones had been boiled, stripped, dried, and catalogued. The marrow had long since been drained, but not discarded. A cauldron, long cooled, contained its residue, congealed into black jelly. The families kept ledgers too. Consumption logs detailing which child had eaten, what part of which ancestor, on what date, and under which seasonal moon, were noted as unstable. Others, like the tongue, ear cartilage, and brainstem, were marked with words like clarifying, controlling, or communion grade. One haunting entry read, "After eating the left ear of great-uncle Tobias, Elias now understands." For languages, he weeps in sleep, but the nightmares had become instructional. It became clear that this was more than cult behavior. This was doctrine refined into curriculum. The family was not merely feeding, they were teaching through consumption. Legacy was no longer passed through word or blood, but through seasoning and ritual. Reaching 1720, rumors spread of a traveling surgeon named Mercy Brahm, a woman in a cloak of stitched teeth who offered lineage cures to barren families. She claimed she could make their blood strong again, return memory, restore tradition, bless unborn generations. Her price, one bone, a sacred one, something buried long ago and soaked in familial grief. Those who agreed said she would grind the bone, blend it with animal lard, anise, and clove, and insert it into a mother's mouth while she slept. In every case, pregnancy followed. In every case, the child was born with full teeth. No cries, no blinking, and in every case, the child's first word was a name no one in the family had spoken in decades. In the Thor of 1724, after a particularly brutal winter, clawed its way through the Kerala. Strange cargo began arriving by flatboats along the Yadkin River. Not lumber, it's not salt, but crates sealed with wax and ash, addressed only with a sigil, a spoon submerged in a coiled spiral of smoke. The recipient was a Dutch physician named Dr. Adrian Selk, a man officially banished from New Amsterdam in 1711 after accusations of anatomical heresies. He had relocated to the foothills of what would one day be Rowan County, where no church dared build and no constable lingered. There he founded the House of Concordia, a supposed healing lodge for the chronically ill and the spiritually fractured. Concordia advertised no services. It had no signage, yet its reputation spread quickly. Women with stillborn histories left with children. Old men with failing minds returned, lucid and trembling. And then there were those who simply never returned. A missionary who visited in 1726 described the lodge as immaculate, but cold. The walls were paneled in bleached pine, and the halls lined with basins of bone dust for purification. At the heart of the estate was a round dining room with 8 chairs, each spaced with surgical precision. In the center, a cast-iron brazier, constantly lit, filled with what the doctor called ancestral broth. The missionary claimed the scent was not of food, but of confession. He was served tea. He drank hours past. He wrote later that he saw his mother dead for years, walking through the corridors with meat cleavers for hands, weeping blood repeating his sins back to him in a voice that was not hers. Concordia, it turned out, was not just a lodge. It was a filter. Patients were served slivers of flesh derived from their own family lines, smuggled in those wax-sealed crates from burial plots across the colonies. Selk believed trauma, memory, and sin could be purged through corrective ingestion. Pain metabolized became understanding. Shame once chewed could become scripture. He published a single pamphlet in 1727 on the digestive path to God, in which he argued that the soul was stored not in the heart or brain, but the stomach. He who eats his line consumes his flaws. He who eats beyond it inherits more than blood. He inherits purpose. Word spread, and in the following year, Concordia doubled in size. The land surrounding the lodge was converted into what Selk called the Grove of Remembering. Human bones were planted in soil alongside herbs. Bone meal mingled with rosemary, crushed teeth with lavender roots. The garden, it was said, grew nothing visible, but those who stood in it claimed they could hear conversations beneath their feet, conversations spoken in the voices of the dead. One young girl, aged 11, reportedly wandered into the grove during a thunderstorm and returned hours later, tongue black, speaking fluent French.
Ow.
Though she had never heard the language, she wept constantly. When asked why, she replied, "Because she's still down there. She wants out of my mouth." By the time spring returned, in 1730, Concordia had become a pilgrimage site for certain bloodlines, those whispered to be favored by the communion. Families whose ancestors had partaken in early forest feasts, descendants of kindreds perish, or the Rennell logs. They came with bone relics, wrapped in velvet jars of marrow, preserved tongues, payment, sacrament, ingredient. These families weren't seeking miracles. They were seeking continuity, a way to stabilize their legacy in a land devouring its own history. It is recorded that in 1732, a council of 7 women arrived at Concordia under moonlight. They bore no names, only teeth worn on necklaces and a ledger bound in skin. Selk greeted them at the garden gate and admitted them without word. For the next 3 days, no smoke left the brazier. No servants were seen. Only the howling of what one neighbor described as children learning to scream backwards. When the women departed, they left behind no names, no bones, but on the lodge door was nailed a new sigil, a spoon now split in 2, bleeding from the break. Silk disappeared the next day. Concordia was left to rot. A final letter found folded beneath the hearth read, "I have tasted too much. Their grief is too heavy, their hunger too loud. They speak in me now. They have learned to season sin." The cold came late that year, not the ordinary chill of winter, but something older, an air that carried not just frost, but the scent of old spoiling things. It crept down from the mountains into Virginia's western basin. Curling through the shutters of a new medical school founded under royal charter, the College of St. Giles prided itself on advancing anatomy in the colonies, but behind its lecture halls, hidden past the surgical amphitheater, and beyond the mortar-washed cadaver pit, stood a locked annex with no formal designation. Its door bore no crest, just a single brass plate polished to clean, the cranial. Trust. The trust wasn't part of the curriculum. It was invitation only, and its members weren't students. They were descendants. Each one had proven their bloodline through tooth records, innovation of the communion's own making. A method that not only cataloged hereditary features, but tracked flavor signatures embedded in calcium. According to the trust's private texts, the more seasoned the tooth, the more often it had chewed human flesh, the clearer the ancestral resonance. Once admitted, inductees were given a test, not written, not told, culinary. They were handed a tray of flesh, prepared without context, and instructed to consume at point 4 afterward. They were expected to recount the donor's memory, their sin, their death. Those who succeeded were marked behind the ear with a heated spoon pressed flat into the skin. Those who failed were used. The man who orchestrated it all was a surgeon-philosopher named Emmerich Duval, a French transplant who had once served as an apprentice under Dr. Adrien Selk before Concordia's collapse. Duval believed Selk had not gone far enough. Memory was only the beginning. He theorized that intent could also be passed, that by consuming those who held secrets, one could inherit not just knowledge but will. To test this, he acquired letters, real letters, stolen from governors, merchants, and traders. Then he fed their flesh to his students and measured the resulting behavior. One acolyte, after consuming a revolutionary courier's calf muscle, recited, a hidden route from Boston to Halifax that hadn't yet been discovered. Another fed the lungs of a drowned heretic, spoke underwater for over 2 minutes without breath. It was no longer about taste. It was about design. Beneath the annex, Duval constructed a vault. There, in cold wax-lined drawers, he stored what he called living cuts, strips of harvested tissue kept alive through a concoction of rendered fat birch oil and communion salt. Each was tagged not by name, but by purpose. Confession, tongue, courage, thigh, deception, liver worship, heart, fat. But the crown jewel of his collection was known as the choir platter, a disc of overlapping vocal cords stitched into a lattice with dried nerve fiber. Duval claimed that when the room was quiet and the candles low, it sang no words, no melody, just wet, pulsing vibration like breath without lungs or prayer without scripture. It was said he fed a slice of this platter to one chosen pupil every year, a rite called the rehearsal. The chosen would then be sealed in the vault for 7 days, fed nothing but communion wine and boiled ashbur. Upon emergence, they would write pages and pages of unknown languages, diagrams, and dreams. Many went mad, a few died. One flayed himself and left a single word painted across the walls in his own blood, craving. Eventually, whispers of Duval's work reached London, not through scandal, but admiration. Certain members of the Royal Society requested samples. One of the founding members even offered a bribe to acquire a full menu of usable parts. Duval declined. He claimed the secrets belonged to the land, not to monarchs. This refusal was his undoing. The following spring, the annex was found burned, the vault shattered, every sample gone. Duval's head was discovered inside a pickling jar on the chancellor's desk. His mouth stuffed with rosemary and his tongue bitten in half. There were no suspects. But that same month, a new cook was hired in the governor's estate, an older woman, with a braided hair mask and a tooth set into her forehead. The kitchen staff said she never spoke, but she made exquisite broth. And each night the governor's dreams were clearer than they'd ever been. There is a court that never issued summons. Courthouse with no columns, no gallows, only benches. Made of thigh bone and silence, pressed like ash against the walls. The communion called it the inheritance table. And by the 1740s, it no longer rules through whispers or shadowed rites and root cellars. It ruled through legal digestion, a system of internal arbitration where disputes of blood, lineage, and memory were resolved. Not with paper, but with flesh. It began in North Carolina's Piedmont region, where 3 families, the Brains, the Owello, and the Fens shared a valley rumored to have been blessed with perpetual yield. Their soil never failed, their livestock never sickened, and their children always healthy, always obedient. The secret, they claimed, was heritage fidelity, a process by which the eldest member of each family line would, upon nearing death, designate their culinary heir, the one among their kin who would inherit not land or titles, but experience. The brain would be removed, dried, steeped in wine, then divided into three parts: memory, instinct, and sin. Each piece would be consumed by a different child. Whoever endured the final bite, always the sin, became the heir, and the rest bound, by taste, compelled to follow the one who had eaten deepest. But in 1744, two families claimed the same heir, a boy named William Braw, son of two bloodlines, each of whom had secretly raised him on differing ancestral diets, one on tongue and marrow, the other on fat and tendon. Both believed they had seeded him with loyalty, so they invoked the inheritance. Tabled deep within a barn wrapped in charred animal pelts. The elders gathered, the floor was salt-lined. At the center, a long table covered in preserved cuts from both bloodlines. Dried thigh strips, smoked shoulder, flaked eyelid, harch. William was summoned. He was 16. He was instructed to eat only what he remembered. That was the rule. The meat would call to him. The table would recognize its heir. He ate 7 cuts from the brains, 3 from the oust, and one unmarked, unclaimed, wrapped in prayer cloth, stitched with child's hair. When he finished, he wept. He asked, "Why do I remember drowning?" The eldest nodded. "Because your true mother never lived above ground," Will declared, split-tongued, a heretic. He had inherited from neither line, but from a forgotten one buried too far back, one that fed below the threshold. He was fed to the table. They boiled his tongue, split it lengthwise, and served it with blackberry reduction to all present. Each person who tasted it saw the same vision: a forest made of bone, a table stretching beyond the horizon, and a woman with her eyes sewn shut, chewing in perfect rhythm with the earth's tremors. From then on, the inheritance table was seen not as judgment, but as revelation, blood law. Evolved. Feasting became a form of oath. Biting a specific cut from a shared ancestor was legally binding within communion circles, a contract etched not in ink, but in digestion. They called it binding by broth. Laws were taught not by reading. Precedence, she won. The loser was served as tuition. The communion expanded into arbitration. Disputes over marriages, property lines, betrayals, and curses were judged through competitive memory tasting. Witnesses presented cuts from their lineage to prove truth. A wrong taste led to madness, a correct one to clarity, to justice. And when records were destroyed or unclear, they turned to legacy cuts. Flesh smoked in clay urns for decades. Some dating back to the 1600s, these were considered incorruptible, holy, the closest thing to a sacred archive the communion possessed. Some of these were never eaten. They were consulted, laid out during ceremonies, their scent inhaled while chanting, their juices dripped into infant mouths as baptism. A child baptized in legacy was expected to never lie. If they did, their bones would ache until confession. By the end of the decade, the communion no longer feared exposure. Its members served on county boards, supplied meat to parishes, passed on family cookbooks, but were really case law. One such volume, The Digest of Heirs, detailed 47 confirmed recipes for proving loyalty, 12 for enforcing silence, and 3 for inflicting madness across bloodlines. It was bound in facial skin, flayed from a traitor. The table was no longer just a place. It was an institution, and it was hungry. By the time the colonies began dreaming of liberty, the hollow communion had already learned how to feed off freedom. While ministers whispered revolution from pulpits and blacksmiths sharpened iron for unseen wars, the communion slid quietly into the marketplace, not through blood rites or bone circles, but through food. The table, once a sacred altar hidden in basement, now wore an apron and greeted you at the tavern door. In the booming port town of Portsmouth, a tavern called the Fourth Dish opened in 1756 with no signage. Just a spoon nailed to the doorframe and a smell that drifted across cobblestone alleys like an invitation. Your stomach understood before. Your mind caught up. Its meat pies were famous, stews legendary. No spice could match their flavor, no cut ever stringy. It was said that the food tasted like dreams you'd forgotten you missed. Patrons swore they left the tavern with memories that didn't belong to them. One man claimed to recall the death of a sister he never had. Another awoke fluent in Gaelic. A widowed seamstress began speaking to her dead husband in her sleep, describing events that had occurred after his death. None of it was chance. The tavern was operated by a guild known as the Benevolent Gastronomy League, a polite name whispered in merchant circles but recorded in communion doctrine as the Bone Wine Syndicate, formed by chefs trained at the remnants of St. Giles Cranial Trust. The syndicate operated dozens of kitchens across New England, each with a singular philosophy: feed the memory into the culture one dish at a time. They smuggled remains cured and powdered into spice blends. They replaced marrow with bone jelly and soups. And for their wealthiest patrons, who paid in secrets rather than shillings, they offered the private course. This involved a 7-part meal tailored from the guest's family tree, a meat from their line, a meat from arrivals, a meat that no longer had a name. After consuming the final course, guests often fell into trances. They claimed to remember the moment their ancestors first committed betrayal. Others became paralyzed with guilt, weeping for crimes they had not yet committed. The Bone Wine Syndicate justified this as therapeutic dining. They published a treatise in 1760 on the restoration of generational harmony. Through digestive revelation which argued that emotional dysfunction could be traced to unconsumed truth, their answer roasted. It was during this period that the communion forged its most insidious innovation: salt contracts. Salt contract was not written on parchment but baked into salt-cured flesh. The terms were encoded in arrangement. How the meat was sliced, how many pinches of marrow salt were applied, and whether the dish was served hot or cold. To agree to the contract, one simply had to eat it. No witness required. The meal became binding, the consequences irreversible. Some were economic inheritance shifts, land sales, marriage agreements, but others reached deeper. One man ate a contract intended for his brother, and over the next 7 days forgot his own name and assumed his brother's mannerisms, accent, and guilt. It became clear that the communion had moved beyond tradition. It had become currency. Traveling butchers carried sympathy cuts wrapped in cold cloth sold under the counter to grieving families. Want to understand why your mother left you? Eat her spine trying to win a lawsuit. Chew a sliver of the judge's brother planted months earlier by a syndicate agent and smoked with clove and rat root. Even local governments were not immune. A mayor in Rhode Island confessed on his deathbed that he had not ruled for 15 years. "The man in the cellar does the choosing," he said, "and I eat his leftovers. That is the law now." But for every evolution of the doctrine, something darker returned in kind. Beneath every dish, every signature blend, every salt contract, there remained the same ancient whisper: feed her, or she will feed herself. One chef, driven mad after preparing a heritage feast for a visiting Dutch banker, carved those words into his own tongue before boiling it and leaving it behind as a receipt. The feast itself contained slices of his own children labeled by age, emotion, and usefulness. And the banker, he requested the recipe. By the dawn of a new revolution, the communion faced something it had never feared before: doubt from within. Where once there was a singular hunger, passed mouth to mouth, jaw to jaw. Now there were disagreements, not about the flavor, not even about the sacrament of flesh, but something far more dangerous: interpretation. The feast was no longer enough. The bones wanted meaning, and meaning meant division. The fracture began. Within the Blanchford family estate in southern New Jersey, nestled beneath a ring of willow trees rumored to grow from a buried communion pit, the estate long regarded as a cradle of pure lineage hosted what would become known as the final 8-tongue supper in 1766. Representatives from each of the major communion bloodlines were present: the Brains, the Renelaires, the Owello, the Durkins, and the new line known only as the Vane Rights. The dinner began as always in silence. The courses were ritualistic: Ellers's tongue, the father's tendon, the newborn's nail-blanched palm. But when the fourth dish arrived, a seared slab of back meat engraved with the symbol of the hollow woman, two heirs refused to eat. One whispered, "She no longer speaks to me." The room froze. This single act of resistance shattered the table's unity. Half of the diners stood in outrage, citing the cookbook of names, which declared any rejected course a rejection of lineage. The others remained seated, grim and tight-lipped, eyes heavy with fear, not of her, but of what she had become. Some claimed the hollow woman had grown silent. Others whispered she had been eating alone, no longer needing vessels. A new theology began to rise among the younger communion, one that argued the act of feeding her had always been a manipulation, that perhaps she was never divine, only an echo left behind by ritual cannibalism, a flavor hallucinated too long. These dissenters formed the doctrine of the empty bowl. They proposed that the soul was not gained through consumption, but lost. That memory degraded every time the flesh was cooked. Heritage was not passed, only hollowed like a bone pipe whistling nothing but madness. Their heresy spread like mold. By the summer of 1768, skirmishes broke out between old line practitioners, still faithful to the doctrine of tooth and tongue, and the empty bowl faction who believed in starvation as devotion. They began fasting not from necessity, but from principle, letting their bodies deteriorate as an act of ancestral silence. Some even sewed their mouths shut with strands of hair from their grandmother's combs, walking naked into forests, whispering, "If I am not chewed, I am free." The old tongue responded with fire. Whole households were burned, their tongues cut out and salted, buried in the corners of old kitchens as warnings. Cookbooks were rewritten into war manuals. A new generation of blood chefs emerged, priests who cooked not for remembrance but vengeance. Recipes were weaponized. One dish, the false inheritance, was said to render any who consumed it loyal to the wrong bloodline, unable to distinguish mother from stranger. Another braised reversal induced decades-old confessions by triggering specific memory clusters through bone broth steeped in teeth dust. Entire towns turned against themselves. One New Hampshire village, once a communion stronghold, consumed its mayor live after discovering he had served hollow meat, meaning flesh without memory. The accusation he had diluted the flavor with unblooded meat from strangers, corrupting the lineage. His trial lasted 2 hours, his roasting, by 1770. A new faction emerged from the carnage, the mouthless clergy. They were once chefs, once recorders of flesh. Now they refused to speak at all. Their belief, if the bones no longer remember, neither should we. They roamed from ruin to ruin, collecting the spoons of dead heirs, melting them into masks that covered the lips and the eyes. They could not eat, they could not see, but they could feel the hunger of others, and they judged. It said that when a communion house burned, the clergy stood outside, arms outstretched, ash falling into their mouths, not to swallow, but to erase. As the colonies edged toward war, the communion spiraled inward. The feast had turned on itself, and still, somewhere deep in the cracked roots of a forgotten kitchen she chewed, as whispers of independence stirred in parlors and printing presses, the hollow communion faced its greatest transformation yet, not from within its rites, but from without. The rebellion swelling in the colonies didn't threaten their rituals, it reshaped them. The communion fractured, blood-drunk, and buried beneath decades of secrecy. Discovered an opportunity in revolution, not to hide behind it but to feed it. Across Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and the Kerala's old communion families began forging alliances with patriot cells. They offered safe houses, maps, even sustenance, but never ordinary food. Their gift was inheritance provision, meals laced with bone essence of executed monarchists and turncoats. The belief that consuming the coward would fortify courage, that chewing the traitor's tongue would render your own voice immune to confession, they named it resurrection cookery. But this wasn't merely metaphor. The communion saw in the revolution a sacred inversion. The colonists were severing their line to the crown, just as the communion had long severed bloodlines to feed their own. It was perfect theology. So a new ritual emerged, one that would forever bind the communion to the founding myth of Tounding. America, the eating of the crownless. The ritual began with a loyalist corpse, preferably one executed by patriot hands. The heart was removed, boiled, and poured over cornbread, laced with powdered knuckle. The brain was rendered into a thin custard and served in hollowed apples, often alongside cider sweetened with marrow syrup. And the tongue, always the tongue, was roasted with sage and sewn onto a linen flag before being eaten bite by those pledging new oaths. Each such meal concluded with a bloodletting, not to weaken, but to season the bones of future rights. It was said that those who fed on the crownless dreamt of new flags, none identical, each bearing not stars or stripes, but rows of teeth in place of stars and tongues, curling like serpents in place of stripes. Not all factions embraced this. The older bloodlines saw it as corruption. They called it flesh federalism, a bastardization of the sacred rites, replacing ancestral honor with political flavor. But the youth, those who had never knelt at the inheritance table, who had grown up eating mixed cuts in taverns and passing contracts in the form of meat pies, embraced it. They called themselves the Devouring Sons. In 1774. 1 year before open war, the Devouring Sons staged a feast in secret beneath Boston. 12 initiates, 1 torch, and 1 body. It had been a tax collector, his ledger still clutched in hand. His fingers were turned into broth, his blood painted across the ribbones and scraped into soup bowls. Each son took a single oath after eating. I am no longer my father. I am what I consume, and I consume the old world. Those same sons, each one later appeared in various patriot militias. One was recorded in Lexington, another in Valley Forge. A third died at Bunker Hill, with a grin and the taste of shoulder meat still on his breath. But it wasn't patriotism that drove them. It was absorption. The communion had found something greater than legacy. It found momentum. And now every battlefield became a butcher stall. Every hanging a harvest, every hero an ingredient. In the waning days of 1776, a prominent Virginia family hosted a clandestine banquet following the reading of the Declaration of Independence. The menu: flesh from a royalist cousin and marrow from a deserter's child. The guests wore white wigs, lined with boiled sinew and toasted not to liberty but to digestion. They did not chant freedom. They chanted palate before Parliament. Even George Washington, unknowingly, was served communion spice blends by a sympathizer embedded in his quartermaster ranks. The records were redacted, burned, lost, but a single letter survives, written in invisible ink, now recovered by descendants. Of a Braw archivist, it reads, "He eats well, never dreams the same twice. We fed him fragments of a crown. He's beginning to believe in destiny." The communion, though divided in doctrine, was unified in outcome. America would not be founded. It would be consumed into being, and from its feast would rise a republic that forgot its own hunger, while the bones beneath its soil remembered every bite. In the wake of revolution, when parades faded and muskets is cooled, a quieter war began. One fought not with powder or parchment, but with spoons, silence, and memory. The hollow communion, having fattened itself during the chaos of war, now faced a bitter reality. Victory had made the table crowded, too many mouths, too few true bloodlines. The meat once sacred had become symbolic, and so the communion turned. Inward once more, not to vanish, but to refine in a sun-scarred corner of upstate New York, 3 families convened in secret in the autumn of 1781. The Blanchfords, the Brams, and the Fenns. The site was a cellar below a farmhouse burned during a British raid. Restored not with wood or brick, but packed earth and bones repurposed into beams. This was the root hall, and what happened beneath it came to be, known in later whispers as the culling of the second palate. The problem was inheritance. Too many heirs had survived the war. Too many had tasted, and not all tongues were suited for memory. So a new trial was devised: palate separation. Each chosen heir, typically between the ages of 12 and 19, was locked in a chamber for 3 days with only one source of nourishment: A single body from their own bloodline prepared across 5 courses. Nothing was labeled. They were instructed to eat, then name. And if they could identify the blood relation by taste, alone, name, sin, virtue, and final memory, they were judged worthy. If not, their tongues were removed and ground into communion. Salt for future meals. Only 5 survived that first culling. 1 went mad. 2 disappeared into the woods wearing masks sewn from their own hair. The remaining 2 were proclaimed palate-bound, first of a new order that believed flavor was destiny and that ancestry should not be preserved. It should be edited. By the time spring rolled across the valley in 1783, palate-bound circles had formed in other states. They practiced selective consumption, eating only the parts of a family member that held clean memory. The lungs of the brave, the heart of the loving, the jaw of the honest, the jaw of the honest. Sins were discarded or sold. A black market economy emerged. Flesh peddlers hawking slices of unclaimed virtue for those wishing to rewrite their inner bloodline. A tongue from a scholar here, a shoulder from a long-dead general. There it wasn't always real, but it always changed the consumer. One merchant advertised original pilgrim thumb knuckles salted for clarity, aged for reverence. More terrifying. Still, it worked. People remembered things that weren't theirs. Prayed in dialects they had never heard. Claimed inheritance to lands they had never seen. By 1785, lineage disputes became violent again. But now the battles weren't over land, they were over flavor. Accusations flew that so-and-so's heir had tasted only wives, or that another had cheated the table by seasoning stolen meat with rosemary to disguise the sauce. In a Pennsylvania township, a young boy named Isaac Fenn hanged himself with his own apron string after failing the palate trial 3 times. His family served his feet in stew to the rest of the children, saying he walked poorly now. He walks in them, but not all evolve with cruelty. A small enclave in Rhode Island began practicing silent feasts, communal meals in which no one spoke, no one named, and no one remembered. Their belief that by consuming without questioning, they returned to the roots of the communion. They called it the unweighing. After the meal, participants often slept for days, waking with blood on their lips and dreams not of ancestors, but of a vast, dark kitchen filled with voices, cooking something that had no end. One woman who attended such a feast claimed she awoke knowing how to cook a man's guilt until it steamed like jasmine and could be spread on toast. By 1787, communion lineages had become so interbred and convoluted that a new classification emerged, the mouthless line. These were individuals born of multiple communion fact, said to have no ancestral loyalty, no memory flavor, and no sense of inherited sin. They were feared, hunted, and in some circles revered as blank slates, meatless in mind, marrowless in guilt. Some families began feeding them bits of their own lineage, trying to seed new saints, new leaders, new blood gods. Most mouthless died from spiritual starvation. One didn't. She began writing her memories backwards on meat cooked medium rare, fed to children with no parents. As the decade waned and the ink dried on the Constitution, America took its first trembling breath as a new nation, yet beneath the thunder of ideals and the polished language of rights, something older exhaled too. Something that had learned to survive not by conquest but by coagulation. The hollow communion, battered by bloodline. Wars and collapsing doctrines faced its own rebirth. Open ritual had become too dangerous, too visible, too traceable, but the hunger hadn't died. It had evolved. Now, it wore gloves, spoke Latin, and smiled at the dinner table. It began in Philadelphia. In 1788, a well-respected solicitor named Elias Forman published a book titled The Culinary Error on Taste, Property, and Memory. Marketed as a legal treatise, it passed unnoticed by the broader public. But among certain families, those who had dined in silence for generations, it was understood as a codiax. Every chapter corresponded to an old rite, substitution through seasoning, forgiveness via salt, redemption by slow roast. Heirship, it claimed, was not just a matter of bloodline, but of prepared memory. Foreman proposed that lineage inheritance be tied not to land or ledger, but to emotional recall, what one remembered of a parent, grandparent, or sibling. If those memories could be proven or shaped, then the rights of legacy could be reassigned. How then did one prove memory? Simple. Small meal, a quiet gathering, a single spoonful of something prepared from a family recipe, no longer written down. It was the communion reborn as a state culture. Lawyers were taught to ask if beneficiaries had been fed before they were read the will. Entire inheritance cases were dismissed because the flavor lineage did not match testimony. Certain judges even began requesting food samples from both contesting heirs before hearing a claim. They weren't testing the food, they were tasting the truth, and it went deeper.
Oh.
Still, culinary guilds, especially in the mid-Atlantic, began publishing books with strange overlaps. Recipes titled not for ingredients, but for emotional outcomes. Stew for calm recollection, custard to seal regret, pie of obedient sons. The dishes were ordinary on the surface, but the communion knew how to read them, where nutmeg replaced guilt, where rosemary meant silence, where the bones weren't mentioned, but always understood. The final rite of the old order came in 1789 during a private dinner, tended by 13 families in a hilltop estate outside Providence. The hosts were descendants of the Renelair, their kitchen older than the nation itself, each course honored. A century the final dish was not served. It was buried. They called it the ceasing. One by one, guests approached the pit behind the kitchen garden and dropped a single object into the earth. A ladle, a lock of hair, a page from a journal, a spoon carved from horn. The pit was covered in salt and sealed with a ring of lavender and vinegar-soaked stones. No oaths were spoken. Only the wind moved. The communion would no longer be practiced. It would be remembered differently in cookbooks, in the way wills were written, in the unspoken rule that sometimes inheritance begins after the mouth closes. A new phrase entered the private vocabulary of surviving communion homes. The flavor lingers. Let the names change. And so they did. By the turn of the century, the communion no longer called itself by name, but in cellars, in heirlooms, in recipes passed down with care, it still thrived. No longer a feast, now a legacy. The war was over. The tables had been cleared, the spoons put away, yet something remained in the homes that had once practiced the hollow communion. Not fire, not feast, but a faint metallic aftertaste. It hung in the air like damp linen and whispered in the cracks between floorboards. Through the post-war children, those born after the eating had ended, but whose lullaby still carried the cadence of chewing. These children were not told stories of bloodlines or feasts. They were given new words: inheritance, virtue, duty. Their parents taught them silence around the dinner table, not because they were stern, but because silence was safer than remembering. But you cannot raise a generation beneath unmarked portraits and locked kitchen drawers without stirring curiosity. In the northern hills of Connecticut, in the winter of 1790, a girl named Eleanor Ravine began drawing with bone, not chalk, not ink, but crushed ivory scraped from an heirloom spoon found in the attic of her family's farmhouse. Her first drawing was a spiral, her second a table. Her third, a woman with no eyes, lips curled into a knowing grin. Eleonora had never been taught communion rites, but the house remembered. Her mother, when shown the drawings, went pale. "Those aren't pictures," she whispered. "They're invitations." Elsewhere, similar stories surfaced. A boy in Albany refused to eat unless the food was arranged clockwise.
No?
A young woman in Richmond began sleep-cooking meals she could not name. A teacher in Philadelphia recorded a group of orphan students who spoke in perfect synchrony during lunch, reciting phrases and languages no longer taught. Phrases later traced to early communion scriptures. These children were not recreating the rituals, they were channeling them. Psychologists would later call it inherited psychomemory, a theory that trauma embeds itself in more than mind or blood, that it echoes through generations as instinct. But for the surviving communion bloodlines, it was something deeper. They called these children the remembered hunger, not heirs, not initiates, but receptacles. In private gatherings, Families began hosting what they called ghost dinners, silent meals where no food was served. Instead, the children were seated around the table, and the adults watched, waited, took notes, occasionally smile without cause. And sometimes they would speak in phrases that hadn't been heard aloud since the inheritance trials. One child placed a fork across their plate and muttered, "The marrow is spoiled." Another stared at an empty bowl and whispered, "She hasn't been fed in 80 years. These moments were brief, but consistent enough to spark fear and hope. New debate rose among the older bloodlines. Should the communion be restored, not in full, not with feasts and culling rites, but as a memory framework, a way of organizing ancestral trauma into metaphor? Some called it therapeutic, others warned. That metaphor always leads back to meat. A compromise was reached in 1792 by several communion-descended households. They created the spice doctrine. The idea was simple: no more flesh, no more rituals, only flavors. Each spice represented a memory: rosemary for grief, nutmeg for betrayal, cinnamon for stolen love. These were woven into family recipes, not to summon the past, but to acknowledge it, a kind of sensory genealogy. Families began passing down flavor trees, mapping which emotions had been most common across generations. Some took comfort in it, some fell deeper into obsession. One woman kept a jar of cinnamon on her nightstand, convinced it held the scent of her great-grandmother's sins. But the remembered hunger didn't care for compromise. In Ohio, a cellar was discovered beneath an abandoned and inside 14 empty plates arranged in a spiral, and a single diary written by a boy no older than 10. The final entry read, "They say, we don't eat like them anymore, but I tasted the basement and it tasted like names." As the 1790s dawned, hollow communion had receded into scattered lineages, barely visible, spurthan strands strung across early America like phantom silk. The original rites had faded. No more bone broth sermons. No more marrow-marked knives passed beneath winter moons. Yet something more resilient endured. Not the rituals, but the urges beneath them. Scarred tobacco fields and swamps that echoed too clearly, the Morwen family kept one relic: a ledger inked in rust, wrapped in waxy linen. It bore no title, no scripture, only dates, names, and odd notations like "too bitter" or "wept while chewing." The family called it the Remembering Book, and only the eldest daughter was permitted to read it aloud. But by 1791, the youngest, a boy, named Caleb, had begun to dream in flavors. He described in perfect detail the mouthfeel of things he had never eaten. Grandfather's Sunday throat, Uncle Joseph's salt knuckle roast. These were not phrases a child would know, and when he began humming a tune none of his living relatives could place, yet which turned up precisely transcribed in the back pages of the Remembering Book, alarm spread like mold. They took him to a surgeon, then to a reverend, then to a barn with no windows.